Does South African citizenship mean anything today? So maybe as of late you've seen on the news, maybe on social media, South Africans removing foreign citizens from public health facilities, like clinics and sometimes even hospitals. As a result, in doing so, what they do is that they demand identification to prove that these people are either South African or foreign. Once finding out that they are foreigners, they are forced to leave and go to other health facilities instead. It's extremely triggering. So as a result, I will be presenting both sides to this conversation. This channel is called The Other Side for a reason. On the one hand, are these organizations and individuals who remove foreign nationals from public health facilities hateful, xenophobic people who are basically taking the law onto their own hands and basically undermining the law and also undermining the responsibility that a state has in trying to rectify the situation? On the one hand, maybe in favor of removing foreigners from these hospitals, is it a situation where the government and NGOs and bodies alike have begun to prioritize foreign interests, have begun to increasingly ignore everyday South Africans, and also have focused on more so protecting the human rights of everybody else but South Africa? But at the same time, at the heart of it, wherever you land in this conversation, we're all just trying to find a resolution to lack of access to healthcare and many other services. And many people are just trying their best to find solutions. And wherever you land, let's have a discussion. It's called The Other Side for a reason. Earlier this year, a South African citizen was in Zimbabwe, Bulawayo. When he was there, he suddenly fell ill and he needed urgent care. He was not able to receive urgent care while he was in Zimbabwe. However, Limpopo Premier Poppy Ramathuba actually sent a helicopter to go and retrieve this man and bring him back to South Africa for him to be able to receive the necessary urgent care that he needs and deserves. This situation earlier this year raised many questions for South Africans, such as if you were in another country within Africa, maybe even in the USA, maybe even in Australia, would you be able to have access to immediate care and access to assistance in the same way that assistance is offered to citizens, foreign citizens here in South Africa? Very interesting things that came up. Let me know what your thoughts are. South Africa has 64 million people, right? That's a lot of people with different needs. So with populations, people need adequate policing, adequate healthcare, adequate education, certainty, and governance structures like courts and everything. But these things aren't free. They really require a lot of money and resources. And this becomes increasingly challenging, especially when you consider how 32% of South Africans are unemployed. And you begin to see the constraints that government has and also as society that we have in terms of fulfilling these responsibilities like policing, education, and health. It becomes tougher when you also consider how from this population that is working, only 2.6% of South Africans pay taxes from their paycheck. So you begin to see sort of how there's this disparity. Health, education, transportation, policing require money. And you have such a tiny base of people somewhat maintaining these institutions. And this sort of bleeds into issues around healthcare and how clinics and hospitals are often underfunded, have medicine shortages, there's so many other issues alongside mismanagement. But this is one dynamic that plays into it. However, if you're one of the privileged South Africans who maybe have access to medical aid, right? Medical aid, sort of is able to bust you out of that situation and sort of removes you from being able to have to interact with the public healthcare system. However, only 15% of South Africans actually belong to medical aid, and the rest of the 85% of South Africans have to interact with public healthcare. So that being said, right, it's very tricky. And also bear in mind, yes, it's medical aid. Medical aid doesn't cover anything depending on the level that you're on. Sometimes you might have levies. Sometimes your medical aid might pay for certain things or certain procedures. Or maybe you have to also go through many hoops to get your chronic medication covered. As a result, many South Africans do need public health care and also interact with it in a great level in their day-to-day. Consider how last week, Gauteng Premier Panyaza Lesufi made comments about how there is an ongoing crisis, especially when you consider immigration and also a lot of foreigners being within South Africa, and even mentioned how many foreigners are unaccounted for tax-wise, criminally, economically. Even further, there's also this loss of money that is supposed to be circulated within South Africa, what you'd normally hope for. However, many of these foreign nationals are sending money back home to their native countries, and that's not a bad thing. However, this is a critical loss of money for South Africa and has significant impacts, like I mentioned, tax, etc. And this is also known as some of the issues with remittances to South Africans. If we're so committed to Project South Africa and also putting so much effort in trying to rectify our own situation, should people who aren't accounted for be able to benefit from this? Also, what's very interesting, I'm also still somewhat grappling with this issue, is also how many South Africans, whenever they raise these issues in the same way that Gauteng Premier has, is that it's often dismissed as being hateful. However, in many other countries like Spain and Portugal, many citizens have spoken out against the impact that many foreigners and tourists have had on their economies and how it affects their quality of life as citizens. Even in countries like Switzerland and even Japan have tight border restrictions and have tight restrictions on immigration to their own countries. So with all that being said, right, is it more so hate, or is it more so somewhat labels that aren't properly attributed to people being attributed to them? Let me know what your thoughts are. So also, right, even though this topic is extremely triggering, right, it's very easy just to dismiss people as being hateful or people not being proactive enough. But both people on either side are basically also, everyone is all scared. Everyone is trying to basically fulfill a better quality of life for people within South Africa. That is the ultimate goal. So I think sort of like dismissing people as either being hateful or dismissing people as either being lazy, I think it's sort of isn't really fruitful to the entire conversation that we are having around access to critical public resources that South Africans are massively funding. So prior to this moment, South Africa has always wrestled with this issue of lack of access to adequate healthcare. Even under apartheid, for example, there were certain people who had access to meaningful, good quality healthcare, and everybody else just sort of had to fend for themselves and figure out their own situation. However, through this situation, even now where people are removing foreign nationals from their hospitals and their public clinics, many South African citizens are applauding these organizations. How ordinary 12-hour wait times have been reduced to 20 to 30-minute wait times. Or even further, how lack of medicine is no longer an issue in these facilities, that they are able to get immediate treatment and get immediate medication that is necessary for their condition. And also, many people no longer have to go through the trouble of having to wake up at 3 a.m. to be able to make it to the queue by 6 a.m. and being able to hope that just maybe somebody might see you that day. So this comes back to this question, right? Does South African citizenship mean anything? And with that, right, citizenship is a right, and sometimes some people often view it as a privilege. So with the citizenship, you have rights and responsibilities, right? You can't just act however you want to, but you also have duties towards your state. And that could be an entirely different video. So for example, with people who are burning and protesting and also often damage public infrastructure, that also form part of your duty. We'll discuss it in another video if you want me to. But nonetheless, right, citizenship is a right, and alongside it being a right, there are many responsibilities that we as South Africans owe to the country and owe to our society as a whole. And even further, there are some privileges that we are able to access and benefit from. For example, our government being able to protect us from human rights abuses internationally, being able to intervene, for example, in that earlier scenario with Dr. Popi Ramathuba from Limpopo. Even in that situation, that is an exclusive privilege that that South African man has because of the very nature of him being South African. This is all culminated where Zimbabwe's president had actually visited 2 hospitals last week in a surprise visit. And basically, this restored so much faith to many Zimbabweans that this could potentially restore Zimbabwe's health system, as currently Zimbabwe is facing a lot of issues, a lot of struggles with being able to service their people adequately and having enough tools and medicine to be able to meet that demand. And somewhat's very interesting with all that being in mind, how somewhat all these actions have prompted the president of Zimbabwe to go forth and visit his people within their hospital. All this tension within South Africa has culminated in Zimbabwe's president also beginning to take action and looking into their own health situation. So for example, you have kids and they always go eat at your neighbor's house. Your neighbor never ever complains. They always make sure they have your kids' favorite snacks, your kids' favorite food. Everything is fully stocked in your neighbor's fridge. And then eventually someone begin to get used to not having to fulfill that responsibility and having to buy your children any snacks. And then eventually your neighbor starts to say, no, I'm actually tired of this. I can't keep taking care of your kids. My bill is going up. My food bill, all my bills are going up because of your kids. And someone begins to prompt you to actually step in and say, oh my gosh, I need to begin taking care of my kids. My kids don't even have lunch boxes at my house because that's how much they're not used to eating here. So as a result, this is somewhat like maybe a situation that could be related to the ongoing scenario within Zimbabwe. Let me know what your thoughts are. So all that being said, right, on this hand, we have these organizations and civil movements and people who are stating that foreign nationals should not have access to these privileges when many South Africans don't have access to them already, such as healthcare. On the other hand, we sort of have an interesting situation where government and even, for example, the Gauteng Health MEC, the South African Human Rights Commission, has denounced, even Gauteng Premier Panyaza Lesufi have denounced people prohibiting foreign nationals from accessing health facilities. Why is that? Why is that such a case? And why is that they keep saying that we will be in trouble, right? They're not really doing anything. So why are they going to be in trouble? The situation is very tricky as it is a catch-22. On the one hand, many South Africans are crying out that they themselves aren't able to access key resources due to overcrowding and inaccessibility. However, on the other hand, in doing so, many South Africans are pushing out foreign citizens who genuinely have a need for healthcare, who many people are living and existing within South Africa and aren't really in a position to be able to afford private healthcare and turn to public facilities to be able to assist them. And not only that, in their own home countries, maybe are not only just foreign nationals in South Africa, but could potentially be medical tourists who are looking for aid in their dire situation. And just South Africa is somewhat of a lifeline, a literal lifeline to being able to help with aiding them. Maybe they suffer from diabetes, maybe it's HIV/AIDS, or maybe other things like asthma that also have affected many people. So is it just in defending the interests of South Africans, alienating and removing foreign nationals? That is also somewhat being settled by courts, but now with what is ongoing now with the actions of many people and organizations should be like our current modus operandi in this instance. South Africa is a progressive constitutional democracy and one of the places with the most progressive constitutions all around the world. And even further, due to legacies such as apartheid, South Africa has emphasized this concept of never again, ensuring that everyone within South Africa has access to meaningful rights and is able to realize the fruits of South Africa's democracy and the labor that is aimed at being able to further achieve rights and equality for all people here. And as a result, there's been a lot of case law and jurisprudence that not only clarifies the position of South Africa's Bill of Rights that applies to South Africans, but also has extended a lot of these rights to foreign nationals too, such as health. So within this constitution, this wonderful document, right, there are the Bill of Rights. And within it, yes, it's like, okay, for example, you have the right to life. But what does that actually mean, for example? So with that, the government has a duty, a negative and a positive duty. So on the negative side, right, the government cannot just be killing South Africans or people within the country. You would hope so, right? And on the other hand, they have to also work to fulfill and ensure that no South African ever has that right to life compromised. So for example, right, having adequate policing within your country is one of the ways to try and fulfill and realize this right. That is the positive element. And this is just a little nuanced example of that. As a result, the Constitutional Court has been very clear with South Africans and also very clear with government that yes, you have a right where somebody mustn't interfere with that right, but government also take positive steps to further realize it. So as a result of this distinction, the Constitutional Court, the courts as a whole, have emphasized that the government has a duty to protect and even further the rights of South Africans. All that being said, that's why the Gauteng Health MEC, even the South African Human Rights Commission, are telling people, stop what you're doing. The reason why is that if they fail to also prevent the limitation and basically the interference of healthcare to these foreign nationals from these other organizations, they could be held liable. They could honestly be held liable. The government could be held liable, and they could potentially have to bear the brunt of penalties and other legal consequences. So as a result, also this very careful balancing exercise where government is seeing that many people are crying out for assistance, especially in the healthcare, but at the same time, that underpinning of our constitutional democracy still binds the government and a lot of our political leaders too. And that's why, for example, organizations like Operation Dudula, for instance, could also face penalties and also sanctions because they are going out of their way to limit the rights of other foreign nationals and the progressive attempts by South Africa to fulfill and realize healthcare for all. So in spite of this, right, despite this mandate that has been placed upon South Africa by the Constitution, the intenders of it, and also upheld by institutions like the courts, right, there have been cases like, for example, this Mazibuko case began to basically question how much water should be free to South Africans. And with that being said, what actually happened was that they began to analyze and mention that, hey, you know what? Yes, you understand that there is this critical resource that many South Africans need, but at the same time, we don't have money. South Africans, we don't have money here. We just don't have money. Like I mentioned earlier on, a very few people pay tax, for example. So we just don't have the money. We don't have those resources out there for us. So as a result, through this case, they acknowledge that, yes, we have this noble effort to further and try and ensure that human rights are fulfilled for all people. But at the same time, there's also no money. So it's one thing of having the society that you want versus the society that you exist within. So these things being mentioned, right, but even within that underpinning, and also how NGOs, even organizations like the South African Human Rights Commission, even the Gauteng Health MEC, it's also sort of the situation where they are seeing this ongoing sort of tension that exists right now within South Africa, but at the same time fulfilling the duties that are also underpinned within the Constitution, and at the same time trying to foster and remove any hate and any potential harm that could emerge from this ongoing situation between South Africans and foreign nationals. It's not a secret that there have been uprisings and tensions within South Africa, especially alongside issues of xenophobia. However, at the same time, right, South Africans are also trying their very hardest to also express genuine frustration over issues that are ongoing, and somewhat this is also a means of being able to tackle that. But at the same time, right, many other people around the world, for example, I mentioned countries like Spain, Portugal, Switzerland, how they have also acknowledged how their interests lie in that of the people of their country. So at the same time, is there a balancing exercise necessary for that? With that all being said, right, is it possible with all the factors that I mentioned and highlighted and all these concerns, these balancing exercises that need to be done, is it possible to guarantee healthcare access for all within South Africa, or should there be limitations? I don't know, eh? Let me know what your thoughts are wherever you land. Keep the comments respectful. It is okay to have different perspectives, have different ideas. It is okay. Just keep your comments respectful. And yeah, that's all. I'll see you next time. Bye.